So we all know we are here in development cooperation, and in development cooperation there is this famous saying, well, we don't want just to give people the fish, we want to know them how to fish. Well, this is about something different. This is about having the ability to go to the market to find excellent fish at affordable prices. And for this, you need a lot of things. You need a regulatory framework, you need a system functioning, you need institutions, you need actors that do it, that have responsibility, that know how to do it. So this is about governance as a transversal theme, not just giving the fish or teaching how to fish, but getting the fish at the market. Corinne, the word is yours.
Thank you, Alex. So what we would like to do with this session is to introduce the new guiding documents, working papers that we have elaborated, that you get a bit more familiar with it. And Lilian and me are going to present in particular the guide for governance as a transversal theme, so how to apply it in sector work. Now, why you can wait. Why this guidance? Actually, the background of this is that in 2014 there was an evaluation on the governance work of SDC, and the findings were that actually SDC has a lot of knowledge, is doing quite well, but there are still some parts where we can improve our work, especially when it comes to introducing it as a transversal theme more systematically. So that was one of the recommendations, and another was that we should somehow update our guidance documents, definitions, positioning of SDC, because first of all, there was never a document somehow explaining the definition and approach of SDC. What does it mean, governance? There is no policy paper, so there was no policy paper. And we should update the guidance that existed from 2006. There was one on governance as a transversal theme. So these were the recommendations. Then we, as DDRG, got the mandate to do that. And a second reason is that the dispatch, the actual one, governance there, and Josh had already mentioned it, governance is is important as a topic, as a domain in itself, but also as a mandatory transversal theme. So gender and governance are two mandatory transversal themes. So we have to do that, and we need to support also people how to do that. So these were the reasons why we did that also. So it was time to update SDC positioning, provide updated guidance, and for whom? For SDC, but also for implementing staff, for partners, implementing partners.
I didn't get a mic myself. So now, what does the guide actually offer to you as one of our target audiences? So let me quickly show you the guide, actually, what we're talking about. This is our guide. It comes in 3 parts. And what I would really like to stress at the very beginning, it is a working document. So it's not meant to be put on your shelf and left there for it to disintegrate, but it's really meant to be for you used while you do your job, while you implement, while you plan, and while you report. This just as a small disclaimer at the beginning. So the 3 parts. First part is about definitions, approaches, also a glossary. So there will be key governance terms that will explain to you what SDC means by it. It also comes with a list of key priority themes, what we understand within governance. And DDLG is just one of these priority themes. You will find many others, like gender equality, like economic governance, like human rights. Then the second part, that's really the core part of the guide. It's where you find practical guidance of how to apply the guide along the PCM cycle. So there you find, again, the sectors, the priority themes that SDC is working in. You will find a guiding framework. You will find the steps of PCM, as I said already. And there is also an example and overviews of analytical tools that will help you to do your analysis of governance in a certain sector. Then part 3 consists of sector briefs. This part 3 is also very practical, and it's aligned to a specific sector. So as of now, we have elaborated the health sector brief. This is meant for interventions in the health sector to really give you very concrete examples what it means in a specific sector. Water is forthcoming, and there will be others for SDC's priority themes. Maybe a small note on what the document is not. It is not a policy document. This is also forthcoming. There will be a STC governance policy document. It really is a working paper. It does not give you an overview of what everybody else is doing in governance. So you will not find what DFID is doing, for example, in this regard. What is also not at the core of the document is governance in partner institutions. You will find some information, but this is not the mandate of DDLG.
Okay, thank you. So what is actually in the paper the definition of governance? Very briefly, we say it has two elements. It is about the exercise of core state functions, for example, in the management of public affairs and in the and of public resources, so providing services, public resources like land, water, forestries. So it's really at the heart of managing these public goods and services. But it is also very much about the exercise of power. So actually about decision-making processes. So who is actually in that? Who can take part of the decision-making and of exercising this power? So these are some of the key elements of governance. And this, and now you can switch, implies that we need, that it is about the system development perspective. And it is about analyzing and addressing relevant systemic gaps and dysfunctionalities in a system where we have different elements defining a system of managing public affairs or of taking decisions. So we have the whole framework of at the global level conventions, we have laws and institutions at the national level, we have the state actors, you see government judiciaries, parliaments, and then we have different actors interacting with the state institutions like civil society, private sector and others. So these are then all the processes of interaction. And of course, in the middle are the citizens. So it's about working with multiple actors, state, but also non-state actors, at multiple levels. So from subnational, local governance level to national, but also global level, linking it also to the global levels. Or having also programs that are promoting global, good governance at the global level. Then it is a lot about, we say, mind, politics and power. I think this is nothing new to you, but just to reiterate it, when you work in governance, it's always about power and politics. So about the rules of the game, about the power relations and power imbalances, and of course about the incentives and motivations people have in their minds to do certain things, how they do it. So, and here comes the link to political economy and power analysis also. Then, of course, it's not only looking at the framework conditions, actors and level. At the end, the main purpose is actually the people's well-being. So that's why they are somehow in the middle. They, of course, are also actors, but we always have to be in mind, governance main purpose is the well-being of the people. So it's at the heart. When we work for it as a domain, but also when we work as a transversal theme in governance. So it's about contribution to the fulfillment of basic human rights they have. For example, the right to water, or the right to health, or the right to freedom of expression, and the right to participate in public affairs. And there comes the link also to the human rights-based approach, because then we look, when we work with, let's say, local government officials, we see how do they perform in the fulfillment of their duties in view of these basic human rights. Do the people have access to water? Is water available? Is it affordable to everybody? Is it according to their needs that they have? These are all human rights criteria, the availability, accessibility, affordability. So there is a very clear link to that guiding our mandate as well. And then, of course, it's not only about fulfillment of basic rights, but also the contribution to a peaceful coexistence. I think that people can also live in peace together. So there again, when we work in certain sector, we have to think what are maybe potential conflicts in that sector or that can be created, what are possible tensions that can arise. For example, water, we all know that it is a very disputed, or that is a natural resource used by very different people and interests and users, so it can create conflict within a country, but also sometimes cross-border. So we have to be aware of that also and think about do no harm and conflict-sensitive approaches. And that's what we also tried in our guidance, and you will see it then in the analytical framework, that we think of the integration of different concepts. Because I think it's a pity that we always talk, sometimes it's gender, then it's account CSPM, and then we talk about human rights-based approach. But actually it's all interlinked. It's all part of the system. So that's what I was saying. It's about, when you talk about governance mainstream, you talk about inclusion. And you talk about gender mainstreaming. And I thank you, Ursula, you said it very nicely. When you talk about GRB, it's about part of the local governance business. So it's just a part of it, looking at the whole system. So it's about inclusion, gender, human rights-based approach, but also about the whole discussion on conflict-sensitive program management. And if there is a need to deepen certain aspects, then you can take an instrument, a tool, an analytical tool, specifically on conflict analysis to deepen the analysis, but somehow it's interrelated. And this is very important to me that you also understand this. That was our approach to do that. Now the next is
value-based approach.
Exactly. Another important topic is, and this you are already aware of it, SDC has a systemic approach, but it has also a value-based approach. And these you all know are these famous good governance principles. Many of you are familiar with them. So it's about effectiveness and efficiency, about participation, transparency, accountability. It's about equality and non-discrimination and the rule of law. So these are the basic principles guiding our work in what we do. It doesn't mean that we always that we are not context sensitive, or that we say this has to be the model just from the beginning, right? That of course we have to be aware about the context, and we always start from the context and see what is there. How can we build on existing structures? What are the ongoing dynamics we can use and work in a certain direction? Of course, we have to be work adapted, and you know all these buzzwords. We need to choose adapted, flexible, iterative. This is clear, but we still have these guiding principles in mind because we think people should be able to participate, for example. Then we have different governance dimensions.
Exactly. I mean, you can already guess some when you look at this diagram. SDC's approach to governance defines 4 governance dimensions. So one is the governance of states, means at the national level. Their public affairs, they're regulated by national law, it's national stakeholders and players, it's powers amongst different levels within a state. So this is one very important entry point for our bilateral cooperation, for example. Then there's also governance at global level. This is the level where global players pursue a joint agenda. It's regulated more by international conventions. It's public goods at the global level, and the scale is simply much bigger. This, for example, is addressed by some of our global programs, but it's also part of SDC's contribution to multilateral organizations, like the UN organizations, for example. There's also a task force on anti-corruption within OSCE, DAC. This is where SDC interacts really at this global level at governance.
And sorry, Lilian, just to add on that, because one of the working groups, I think on Tuesday, was also how can we better use these global frameworks? No, you were in this group, Erika. So we can also play with that at the national level where we work, to use these principles to enter in a political dialogue or get some guidance there. Sorry.
Yeah, and maybe one important point I shouldn't forget, when we talk about governance at the levels of states, SDC is an extremely important player within there as well. So we are part of the governments at those, within these states we work in. We and all other development players. That's an important aspect. We shouldn't forget that we also changed the game. So another important dimension is governance in our sectors and priority themes. This is what we call narrowly transversal governance, governance as a transversal theme. And it's applicable to all of SDC's departments, meaning cooperation with the South, cooperation with the East, global cooperation, as well as humanitarian aid. Last but not least, there's also a dimension of governance within institutions. So we either call it institutional governance or corporate governance when we talk about private institutions. It also applies to our partners, but of course it also applies to SDCs. It's about rules, it's about code of conduct, and it's about how we position ourselves internally but well as externally.
And we will have an interesting knowledge hub, just to recall,
Exactly.
because I think BENAM made really an effort in this direction to work with partner institutions. And this afternoon, they will offer a knowledge hub, particularly on that, what they did.
Okay, so this kind of sums up a bit what you will find in part 1 of the guide, the more theoretical part. And now we move on to the more practical aspects of integrating governance.
So what we try to do is to structure it along the PCM cycle. So, and the first step always starts with an analysis. And there we try to provide a framework. This is a summary of the framework. What are the different elements we should look at when we make a systemic governance analysis, which is referring to the picture you saw just before. So actually, when we start the analysis, or when we look at the analysis, we look at the framework conditions. What are the laws and policies in place in a given sector? What are they telling us? Are they informed on facts, on what is really needed? Are they also oriented towards, for example, international standards, like, for example, these human rights criteria I was mentioning? How are the roles and responsibilities regulated? Who is responsible for what? How is the financing organized? So these are all important framework conditions you need to know when you work in a sector. And we need to know how is the situations, where are strengths, where are maybe gaps we have to look at. Then the second element is the governance processes. That was on the picture, the different actors all in a circle interacting with each others. So how do they interact? And there we have been using the good governance principles to structure it. So we can really look at are the interactions and the performance of actors. Are they participatory? Are they transparent? What about inclusion? What about efficiency and effectiveness in what they do? So these are then these guiding principles defining the processes and interactions. Then we have also to look at the actors and the rule of the game. So how are decisions taken? How is power executed? Who has power? What are the disbalances of power? What are factors influencing behavior, motivations of people, or disincentives? And how does this influence our sector governance? And here it comes very much also to the political economy and power analysis, which is always important because people are the actors in a system. Then the other category is the conflict dimension. I was already telling it, that we just are aware of it and we look at it. Is there any conflict? Is there a potential of conflict? What are the sources of these conflicts? Are there mechanisms already in place for conflict mediation? Do we need to do something about this? Or is there a way in our sector to contribute to somehow overcome the conflict? That's also a possibility when you have already tensions. So just these reflections when we do an analysis of a sector should also be there. And I mean, if it's then when you think you should go deeper, then you can go deeper and do an in-depth analysis also. But we should at least, when we do a sector analysis, always ask these general questions. Then there is the dimension of regional and global initiatives. I was saying it already. You can also, are there conventions or soft laws ratified in the country where we work? For example, the CEDA or others. Are they in the national laws reflected? Do people know about this? Are they realized? Or other elements like the aid effectiveness agenda or the SDGs, are they known? Do they work with that? So these are elements also we should know and try to see how do we link up and how can we also promote or work in this direction. Or are there maybe interesting global initiatives that we can use? Sometimes there are also global networks or initiatives that might be where we can maybe link up also in a country. So there are different things we might also be able to use. And last but not least is the element of the intersection with other sectors. We all know that there are always these linkages when we work in health, and water is important, water and sanitation, health, everything is linked somehow, and we should just be aware, and in particular if we are in a country with different domains, like we work in different domains, at least think about these domains and the interlinkages. Are there governance deficiencies in other sectors that are maybe affecting our sector we are working in? So these are the key categories we try to define when you start working or you are already working in a sector, think about when you do the analysis to guide a bit or structure your analysis. In the guide we have provided some guiding questions. I mean, there is a series of questions. You don't need to tick all of them, but it's kind of an inspiration for you, a guidance that helps you to think about it. And then also indicators of some possible areas of change that can lead to certain formulation of outcomes or change areas. So this is more kind of an inspiration and guidance for you.
Okay. Can we have the next slide, Hinek? So from your experience, you know that analysis, it takes up a lot of time, also when it comes to integrating governance, but your work is by no means done yet, because there's of course more steps to follow if you really want to make sure that governance is taken into account seriously. So the next step after an analysis, you go about the design of a program and projects. Here again, we have the same guiding categories that you should look at and see whether there you find entry points after you do a SWOT analysis. Of course, this is selective. I mean, we don't mean that you go through every point that you analyzed and you do a SWOT analysis of every point. And so there you really already make a decision of what could be most important areas, what is versus SWOT analysis, and then you define entry points. And in the course of having defined entry points, it comes to very concrete programming. I mean, you go about what could be my theory of change for the desired changes that you want to achieve, what are the outcomes needed, what is your overarching goal. So this is basically programming, but really governance programming within a sector. Then if we move on, Hinek. So we have your program, it's all set up. Now we go about implementation. When implementing, you should also think about, first of all, what resources do you have at hand? I mean, it's your partners that implement your program, project. Do they know enough about governance to really pursue your governance goals within this project? This is something to think of. Then also, of course, what intervention lines you really choose, what measures you're going to implement in order to pursue governance within your sector or priority theme. There it's really about, I mean, you need to empower people, you need to build relationships. So what lines of intervention, the strategic actions you define, this is crucial whether or not you will achieve your theory of change. Risk management, of course, as in any other project, is also crucial to furthering governance in a certain project, and this should be taken into account, especially, for example, if you aim at working on systems, which is, of course, an approach that we would like to promote, but there are certain risks, of course. Then maybe another dimension, especially for conflict-affected countries, you need to decide how to work within this conflict. Do you work directly on it? Do you work in it? Or is it just rather a bit of tentative working around the conflict? So these are strategic actions that you need to design and implement. Then also, please don't forget about governance when it comes to monitoring and evaluation. When it comes to reporting, you need to set indicators and targets. Unless you do have targets for governance-specific aspects in your projects, you will not report on them. You will need to have good baselines. We know this is sometimes a bit difficult for governance aspects, but it's where we start from to define our targets. And then the reporting also requires some sort of analysis. I mean, what has really happened in the governance when it comes to governance within this sector? So there you will also need to go back to your results framework in order to report also on qualitative results when it comes to governance within a sector. Okay, now we talked a lot about programming, about already integrating governance in a certain project. If you need examples, if you need to see how this has been done already, you will find many examples at the end of part 2 of the governance documents. We have structured them in a way that you will find methods and approaches on one hand. For example, you want to strengthen social accountability in a water project. There's an example in there of how you might go about it. If you want to further gender equality in a certain sector, there you'll find an example. Then we also have structured the examples according to sectors. So if there's a humanitarian aid project in your country where you really feel you need to strengthen governance, have a look at the example that we took from Lebanon, I think.
So.
Exactly. So there's many, many examples. Please go through the document, take some time, and I hope you'll be inspired.